It's been a busy set of days here with the HT and HTDs. This morning we kind of changed the faces, a wonderful foray into the history and philosophy and culture of black holes, and specifically the ngEHT. To kick us off today, we have Peter Galison, professor of Harvard, and the director of BHI to get us started and introduce the production also of the next few talks.
Thank you. First, I just want to say it's a pleasure to conference and now get such a good one to the ngEHT. One of the things that strikes me is an old remark of Einstein. He said the difference between theorists and experimenters is this: nobody believes the theory except the theorist who invented it. Everybody believes the experiment except the experimenters who did it. And I think in a way there's a truth to that. We spent years working to make sure that we believe those two great images of M87 star and Planetary Space Star. And remarkably, we did it despite a pandemic and a really remarkably tiny budget compared to the extraordinary dollars that go into I'd like to talk today about the history of philosophy and culture of the ngEHT, one of the 8 working groups. In a way, I think of the longer-term relationship of philosophy and physics as being marked by interest in centuries-old issues of natural philosophy. Newton's Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, his great work of 1687, for example, took time at the beginning to figure out what it was that he meant by time and space. Absolute true in mathematical space and time versus the merely relative to sensible objects. In the 19th century, when Thomson, Kelvin, and Tate produced their natural philosophy, reviewed extensively by James Clerk Maxwell, they emphasized the importance of kinematics and the idea that geometry itself is part of the science of motion. In the 20th and 21st century, Einstein's general relativity in black holes has raised new questions about theory and observation, about space and time, the formation of new knowledge, the role of geometry in the world, the demoted role for force. A century later, black holes may be the most generative object, the most mysterious object that we know, fertile ground for a natural philosophy, that is, for observing, calculating, theorizing, mathematizing, and philosophizing. The group that we've begun here in cooperation with ngEHT is neither a model that's dictated from the outside nor reporting after the fact. Instead, it's trying to be indicated to be in constant interaction with the aims and procedures and methods of the ngEHT itself, and works very closely with the other working groups. We'll be looking, for instance, one of our focus groups is on algorithm frequency visualization, saying some things about that at the beginning, and then turning over to Juliusz Doboszewski on his thoughts about algorithms and the relationship with how we gain knowledge here. The foundations, the relationship of theory and observation have been a constant theme of our foundations group, and we'll be focusing on that meeting with Jamee Elder, who will be the second speaker. And then we'll talk some about collaboration. We have another one of our focus groups, which is dealing with questions of structure, collaboration, and epistemology of collaboration. This is governance, think about larger scale structure, this pivotal moment in the ngEHT collaboration, when there's an opportunity to figure out just how we want to proceed. A fourth group, citing, is going to be working closely with the technical groups on citing inside the ngEHT, integrating the technical conditions of geometry and accessibility with ethical and cultural considerations in citing new telescopes. We heard a little bit about that from Nancy Thrasher and some on the sort of art historical background and framing of visualization yesterday from Emily Skolberg. So that's the broad plan. What I'd like to do is to turn to some considerations about robustness and what that might mean in the context of what we're doing with EHT and ngEHT. In the history of scientific image making, in a kind of cartoon representation of work that I did jointly with Lorraine Daston, you might think of the 18th century as inaugurating a concerted effort to idealize images. When they drew a skeleton in the scientific atlas, they were not interested in a skeleton with a cracked rib or a missing part of a jaw. They wanted a perfect one. So even if you sketched it from nature, as it was said, you sketched it with the skeleton in front of you, you were constantly improving it. Even when you used a camera obscura, you would improve what you saw. That idealization that made those objects depicted a kind of metaphysical exemplar of things that existed in all of their imperfect peculiarities. The 19th century began to talk about objectivity in a way contiguous with our own, when they began to be interested in particulars, in this is a skeleton of this person held in this museum, for example, or this plant, cut in this part of Borneo in this year, in this month. And that didn't displace the universalizing effort, but it added to it like layers of stratigraphy, one on top of the other. Beginning in the 20th century, you begin to have an idea that, in fact, judgment was necessary to depict nature correctly. Trained judgment, not the arbitrary judgment of an individual, but somebody who had been trained in the art of depicting. So for example, that little sketch there, the magnetogram of the sun, the authors said, we could just print what comes out of our machines, but you wouldn't want to see that because we know there are artifacts there and we know how to fix them. The kind of images that we're dealing with and have contributed remarkably to and will continue to contribute to are our current era of the computed image. And I'll have much to say about that as in the moments to come. But this borrows from the various traditions, as we'll see, and I think produces something new and tremendously exciting there. The question that I'll want to pose and begin to address is what an objective computed image might be, what it is that we are after in the ngEHT. Going back to the EHT, the historical sequence that I just outlined, not one displacing the other, but accumulating as resources as time goes on, adding tool to tool, went from ideal to mechanical to expert. We began in the EHT with expert judgment using blind imaging with 4 different groups, each of which had the instruction, their guiding directive was to do whatever they could to get the best image they could from the data after testing out their techniques on synthetic data. Then we said, all right, well, what if blind testing wasn't enough? Maybe we're all subject to the same proclivities, expectations, and anticipations. We should try to do a parametric survey that would cover a much wider ground. And in a sense, use the computer to learn how to sort out the best image based on test synthetic images, and then to apply it to the real data. And finally, in the last stage, we took the various pipelines from April 11th and combined them in averaging in the hopes that this would emphasize the commonalities and de-stress the things that were peculiar or idiosyncratic to one pipeline. That became the canonical image. So in a sense, we've time traveled. We went, instead of the historical sequence, ideal to mechanical to expert, we started with expert, then turned to mechanical, and then idealized through averaging, which is very interesting. It's borrowing the full tools from a range of the history of scientific objectivity in images. Now, the objectivity of the computed images creates new and interesting questions, but it also borrows from a conundrum that's long existed. There's one desire that we've had in particle physics, for example, many others, to be open, to make images that would capture what was out in the world, even if we didn't expect it. If it's in the world, does it get into our heads? We'll call that world head robustness. The other tendency has been to try to test our ideas and say, if we think there's a certain kind of particle, could we set up counters or selection techniques to pull it out of the noise, to be able to use, in other words, head world reliability. The objectivity of the computed image is, this is the argument here, a form of robustness that is a stability under adversarial challenge. The challenges of trying out different groups in blind testing, the challenges of varying the parametric space, many different challenges that we put to it. And the whole of the difficulty consists in figuring out whether the adversarial challenges that we're posing to what we do sort of span the space of the vulnerabilities of the method that we have in mind. That's what we're after. Robustness in imaging and modeling come together, for instance, in the regularized maximum likelihood methods, where we challenge to see if we can choose adversarial priors to test the stability of the images. Do we get the same sort of thing, a ring, even if we initialize or take as a prior different kinds of starting assumptions, disks, two blobs, and so on. Models, we have other forms of adversarial challenging. We want to make sure that if we delete data, that we can predict, in a sense, what that deletion was. If we do, are we overfitting? Are we underfitting? Does it predict new data that's coming in? So we're constantly trying to see if the images that we produce or the models that we produce remain stable under challenge. Do it, and then, or another, for example, an example from the attempt to make dynamical imaging. Do imaging and modeling match over time? They each have different vulnerabilities. They each have different starting assumptions. What we want to know is that we get something that will stay stable. And that, looking forward, is, I think, the main way we're going to have to test out whether we are getting good dynamic images. In particle physics, they're having, in a sense, the opposite problem from the one that we face. Begin with untriggered image gathering events, but then they have too much data. Our data is too sparse. They have a surplus of data, and they have to try to cut it down. In imaging, they can see lots, but they don't see rare events. In the counter or selective technique, they can test what they expect, but you risk ignoring something crucial. So with the earliest particle physics, where you had basically film and you watched particles skitter on their surface, you could see lots of things once they got the film adequate to the day, or they could find the omega minus, which helped confirm the classificatory power of the quark model. But there was also another technique to use counters, coincidence and anti-coincidence counters. In the LHC, you often have to go from 10, with gigahertz, billions of events per second, to try to get a 1 in 10 second event, the Higgs. That cut down was built into hardware. Often these had to be decided. You needed a first low-level trigger that would happen in 3 microseconds. And then there were cuts that had to happen after that. They were just as afraid of the cuts as we are of priors and models. And they started, in some cases, to use blind cutting to make sure people weren't cutting to figure out, to get what they expected, to fool themselves, in other words. The hardware on our side is myriad. we use the Earth, we use the increased number of stations, we are using multiple frequencies, and many more things that we're going to be doing to bring in more data, just as the LHC is constantly working to cut down to a tractable amount, where they cut, for instance, from tens of thousands to tens of events after cutting it down from billions of events to tens of thousands. The modeling is always, in a sense, the non-visual is always in advance of the visual. As you know, we've learned from the early work of several of you here, but also in Jim Moran's instruction to us to learn to love the Fourier transform. We learn to see through the Fourier transform. We learn to see the bounce as rings or other things. And even in the regularized mean likelihood methods, we start by using an algorithmic capture of this sparse data, but it's ambiguous. It's underdetermined what that image is, and we need to use the priors to be able to pull that out of it. In a sense, the RML methods of imaging are a combination of taking in the data in an open-ended way and selecting out in the function of the priors. And I think that's characteristic of much of what we do. We're using in the computed image a combination of expectation and openness, of selectivity and inclusiveness, of head world and world head reliability. So modeling for us is often, typically, in fact, in advance of what we can image directly, whether we're using imaging or attempt to model in 3 dimensions or snapshot modeling. We're constantly using efforts to change these models and to vary them, to see that they're robust, to be able to pick things out of our images and data that might not otherwise be accessible directly from an image. The M-ring models that Michael introduced has been an exemplary instance of this, constantly using models to try to extract information from that which we have. Time and again, the fundamental physical sciences have tacked back and forth between image openness and selective testing. One long interaction that took place over decades, it led to the controllable image in colliding beam detectors, for example, in medicine, in astronomy, in seismology, across a wide range of fields. What we see is a combination now of openness and the imposition of our selective techniques to try to extract information. The MRI, for example, uses many of the same techniques that we use. I'm grateful for that. It saved my life not too long ago, so I have a lot of faith in RML methods. Here's my hope. Let's not see open imaging and selective modeling as in opposition. Like light, electric fields drive magnetic ones, magnetic fields drive electric ones. Let's use modeling to probe and explore, and imaging to capture the unexpected and generate new questions from it for the next generation of modeling. The objective image embodies, like stratigraphy of the Earth, it adds new layers, pressuring older ones through morphological change. Building on the ideal, mechanical, and expert images, we are now squarely in an age of the computed image and have contributed and will contribute powerfully to showing what an objective computed image might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Are open for questions now. Raymond.
Hi, Peter.
Hi.
I have to kind of like, okay, I have to wake up for a question now, but so this is one that is a bit hard to formulate and not quite along these lines, but you know, when these expert computers, they beat a Go game. I'm sure you're aware of that. People had not expected that, right? And one of the reasons was the computer fundamentally played different from a human. A human would never play that way. And the solution that it came up with, in your terminology, was initially incomprehensible. Right? They eventually figured out, of course, why it won. But if you take this line further, these expert systems may present us in science with a solution that we no longer can understand really. It shows us the solutions, but it does not bring comprehension. And, you know, do you have any reflection on that?
It's a great question. And I think a deep one, not only for our collaboration going down the road, but also for science more generally. I think in the case of what I've seen as we begin to use machine learning in our processes is we often will take test cases, idealized or extreme test cases, and see what the machine will do from that. And from these test probes, we can begin to unpack, if not the detailed layering of machine learning or AI, at least the characteristic things that it does. And after a while, you say, oh, well, I know that that routine is going to de-emphasize this or generate extra lobes here or whatever it is. And I think it's an important question. I think if perhaps the way to understand it is going to be practically. We're never going to be able to unpack all the layers of a neural network that's got 5 layers, but we may be able to get a very good characterization of what it's doing. Now, in other branches, people have made the argument famously that we're going to do away with theory altogether, and machine learning is just going to generate the regularities and predict things, and that will be science. I don't think, I'm not so worried about that, at least for us and in the proximate period. But I do think figuring out new tests to understand the characteristic performance of black boxed algorithms is going to be very important.
Very nice talk, Peter. I'm curious about the process of validation of scientific ideas, where now we're looking more for consistencies with modeling, simulation, and the rendering, as you said, of the sort of constructed image. Is this fundamentally different from experimental validation? How do you see, is there tension between these two, or do you see them as a continuum of processes?
I do think there's a continuum between experiment, where the goal is to understand the potential interfering effects of your experiment, but you're always going to have to say, even on a tabletop experiment, ceteris paribus, you're never going to be able to prove mathematically that there are no other interfering effects. So experiment never has the characteristic of a deductive logic. But given that, I think that the new, what I'm calling the objective computed image is, I think, a perfectly good, form of experimental argumentation. Now, how that's going to relate to theory eventually is another question. I mean, if we could extract over the course of the ngEHT, for instance, confirming and persuasive arguments about the n=1 photon ring, that would be an amazing link to very fundamental physics. And so I don't think there's anything here that precludes the ambition of an understanding, to come back to Reno's question, of what we want from science ultimately. But the computed image is different than the other steps on this path. But Albinus is one of the great anatomists of all time. He idealized his image of the human body. Vesalius did, Cheseldin did, and so on. And we don't do things that way anymore, and yet those images remain with us as part of the path to understanding the human body. And I think the computed image is something that's opening up. We are in a new stage of image making. I think it's exciting. I'm not depressed by this. I think it's thrilling.
Over there in the back, thanks for being patient.
Right, so that was quite informative. My question regarding the analogy with particle physics in the first part of the talk. So when the quark model was formulated in particle physics, it was stated that you can never actually observe quarks, but they exist somewhere. So sure, it works. Okay. So do you see any analogies with the skepticism that some people have, that you will never actually see the photon ring? But we know it exists, right? I mean, and you will never actually see the event horizon. despite being called the EHT or the ngEHT. So do you see a way around that skepticism?
Yeah, no, it's a valid question. I mean, you could say, is the inability to see an isolated quark somehow analogous, for instance, to the interior of a black hole? I think that, you know, my view about these things is fairly pragmatic. That is to say, at first, quarks were a classificatory system, like the periodic table of Mendeleev. Then you began to scatter electrons off it, and you could actually see that there are point-like scattering centers, even though you can't pull a quark out and look at it the way you can an electron. Sort of. And then you have a theory that actually combines the quarks in quantum chromodynamics. So I see the understanding of quarks as a progression, maybe not, you know, ultimate metaphysical truth of quarks, but a progressive and noticeable march forward. I think that's going to be so with the horizon. We've begun to have arguments, for instance, presented in the EHT paper 6, that you know, why the horizon can't be a surface reflecting or absorbing. There'll be next steps and next steps and next steps towards understanding more and more about what the horizon is. And theoretically, of course, it's a very active area of research in all sorts of ways, using quantum field theory, conformal field theory connected to anti-de Sitter space, and so on. I think that for the photon ring, I'm very optimistic. I think, you know, it may not be next year or the year after. I think we will see it. We may, you know, need to use many new techniques of modeling, extensive increase in the number of antennas. We'll add to it when we can put an antenna in space. But I don't think there's any intrinsic reason we can't see the photon ring. It's going to be hard, but interesting.
Sure. Did you have a question? We're okay for one more question. Short one.
Just a quick question, Peter. This is really fascinating stuff. I wonder if you could give us a historical perspective, if one exists, on the impact of having to find funding for the research that we do, and how that
Having to find
funding. Like, so for example, you know, it's one thing to think about how we would show that a photon ring exists, but then when you go to the NSF or the European Research Council for money, they're not interested in serendipity. They're not interested in the, you know, expansive exploration of the unknown. They want to know, will you see this, and to what precision level will you make that measurement? And we all know secretly that serendipity is a big part of why we're in this, the unknown. And how do we balance that? How do we satisfy the funding agencies, but also our own innate curiosity?
I think our best hope is, our best historical exemplar is LIGO, where, you know, they said to the NSF, we'll see gravity waves, if, you know, but what they ended up seeing was much more than that. You know, they saw black hole absorption and black hole neutron star. You know, they've extended this to really a new astronomical instrument, not just demonstrating the existence of gravity waves. And I think that that's something like that strategy is probably what we need. Here's what we can promise, and then we hope to do more, you know, we hope for more and the serendipitous beyond that. But I think it's the argument can't be pure serendipity to the NSF or to the ESA or anybody else, but it also can't, it shouldn't be the exhaustive limit of what we hope to accomplish. I mean,
Thanks.
It is amazing that this project has worked on, I don't know, what's the integrated budget of the last 5 years, 60 million, $70 million integrated over the various places. I mean, it's, we're competing in some sense in scope and scale with projects that are $1 billion or several $1 billion. And I think that's amazing. And we did Sagittarius A star in COVID. It's like they said of Ginger Rogers, you know, she did everything Fred Astaire did, but did it backwards in high heels. And I think we did this with a 20th of the budget and during a worldwide pandemic. I think that's amazing. But I think the argument for funding is going to have to be, we're going to have some things we really believe and can argue will accomplish, and then have hopes beyond that. But not to mix the two, not to put the aspirational as promised, but not to ignore the promised, because nobody's going to bet on the purely aspirational. That's my view.
Thank you. Let's give Peter a big hand again. Next up, we have Juliusz Doboszewski from the University of Bonn, going to talk about astrophysical inferences.
Would I go with this? No, better not. Oh, thank you so much. Okay, does it work? I hope so. Yes, perfect. I want to take you to something like a small sample of philosophical perspectives on astrophysical inferences. So, of course, there are many forms of inference in astrophysics, and there are, of course, many philosophical perspectives. Probably, you know, at least twice as much as sort of live and working philosophers. And the particular angle I think may be interesting for us here today is sort of thinking about software-supported inferences. So at various stages in data calibration, imaging, source modeling, and a bunch of others in ngEHT, we will be heavily relying on all kinds of software. And by software, I mean, you know, algorithms and their implementations, simulations of very different kinds. So broadly, software. And it might be useful to sort of keep in mind a kind of comparative perspective. So in other areas of science, large teams of people work on their goals over very long periods of time. And often, for instance, in cosmological simulations or in climate models or in many other areas, they also heavily rely on software. And so we could try to isolate some maybe nice or maybe problematic or maybe simply curious and interesting features of software that they have that we can encounter in those other cases. We can explore the consequence of those features, to sort of what these features can lead to. Maybe some of those consequences are unwelcome, so how to mitigate them. Maybe some of them have already happened, for instance, in ngEHT, and whether we want to do anything about it or maybe just accept things as they are. And I will sort of take you through two features. The first is this, and it's a bit of jargon, but basically the idea is that complex software has complex history. We call it entrenchment because I guess we like to make our life horrible with jargon. But basically the idea is that, you know, software is complex. It has been written and rewritten and piecewise updated and adjusted over many iterations. And of course, there's sort of something like an ideal situation, and then there's the real world. So ideally, something like a simulation code may be constructed from sort of discrete, neatly separated modules. Each accounts for some different physical effect. But within each module, the particular problem we're interested in has to be transformed into an algorithm that can be feasibly implemented on the computer. And sort of those implementations are very rarely sort of principle driven, but they can be done in very different ways. Some might be more principled, some might be very pragmatic. Most of them will be sort of a mix. And so, for instance, choices of parameter values or couplings or estimates or approximations and so on. There's I guess many of you know better than I do. There's an element of pragmatic choice of the person doing this particular piece of code. And so in sort of among philosophers who looked at, for instance, the way that models and simulations are used in climate science, people notice that those models are in interesting ways products of their specific histories. They're developed and adapted to specific sets of circumstances and set of constraints, and those histories leave sort of imprints on those models. So this is something that happens. You know, many of those models have histories that go date back to the 1960s, 1970s, and have been sort of updated and improved ever since. And so you may be worried, oh no, like maybe there are some historical imprints on the particular models that we're using. So is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Well, it's a mixed thing. I think sort of situation that gives rise to this form of historical entrenchment has some good sides. For instance, in the short term, those constraints can express something like temporary consensus of collaboration. We can have faster workflow, and of course, extensive documentation for most people is boring and time-consuming. So if we cannot do this, this is great. However, in the long term, understanding what such a piece of software does may be hard. This will relate to the second sort of theme I will be talking about. And there are other potential problems. For instance, developers of the code may move away from the project, live on sort of limited documentation, and if we don't keep track of all of those choices that may be to some extent arbitrary or not dictated by some sort of principle, then the particular piece of software we're using may be unreliable in ways we're sort of not controlling. Kind of over time, it's here and now it may be good and reliable, but in 15, 20 years, the situation could be worse. The threshold of entry for people who join in later may be hard because there may be a lot of tacit knowledge. And there are also issues with sort of information transfer, especially if you think in terms of longer timescales. And you could ask, well, is information transfer really a problem? And I think it is. And here's, I think, an instructive example. Even in pure mathematics, where very little software is involved. There's a theorem that classifies a particular type of mathematical object, so-called finite simple group. Never mind what they are. The statement of the theorem is that basically there are 3 types and 27 exceptions. And that's a complete classification. And sort of the question of classification goes back to the 19th century, but people really start working on this in the 1950s. And over 30 years, 100+ mathematicians sort of fix this modulo at particular loops of 25 years later in some 300 to 500 articles on something like 5,000 to 10,000 journal pages. This is the sort of first generation proof of the classification theorem. And soon after, some 10 years after, mathematicians started to work on the second generation proof. And there are some sort of more systematic mathematical reasons for doing second generation proof. But one of the sort of risks finite group theories face is the risk of what sometimes is called uninvention of a proof. So as one of the mathematicians who worked on this subject, Orenstein, put it, without the existence of a coherent exposition of the total proof, there is a very real danger that will gradually become lost to the living world of mathematics, buried within the dusty pages of forgotten journals. So in a way, this is an issue of information transfer. Here we have this beautiful classification, but it's an enormously complex beast. Maybe there's not even a single mathematician who understands the proof. It's in its entirety. And so kind of as people move on with their lives or retire or worse things happen to them, the sort of body of tacit knowledge on which the proof rests might be lost. And there are many reasons for that. Sort of community collectively forgets how to prove the theorem, or maybe different parts of the proof may be lost. Maybe some sort of local errors in the proof cannot be corrected anymore. And so, this is a situation that actually has happened even in the sort of pure mathematical setup. So a situation of a community working with a software that might no longer be constantly developed and maintained, in a way, might be much worse. Now, this is a striking example, but of course we should not worry so much. And this particularly spectacular form of potential uninvention, and we should be worried about information transfer, not so much about uninvention. I think we're much more, the ngEHT will be much more open-ended. It's not like here's a theorem to be proven, and after that, this case closed, we move on to different things. It's more, ngEHT is more open-ended. Community is much larger. I think there may be more of us here than finite group theorists by the time that classification has been completed. And timeframes are different. But so this, I think it's an instructive example that shows that information transfer can be a problem. Okay, back to historical entrenchment. There's a number of things that can be done about it. We can do comparison projects, and ngEHT is actually doing that for the grNHD codes. We can do parameter surveys, as Peter discussed. We could do code commenting, we can try modular design, but it's I think it's an open question to what extent the potentially negative features of entrenchment can be remedied by these sorts of strategies. And I think this is a sort of challenge that, you know, maybe won't run in 5 years, but in 15, the situation may be different. Now, I want to very briefly talk about opacity. So the opacity is a problem that sometimes inner workings of the model are inaccessible to the user. The software is like a black box. And of course, complex models with complex histories can become opaque. And machine learning techniques also often lead to sort of lack of transparency and opacity. But of course, such techniques might be of use in ngEHT, because automated processing of large amounts of data is a useful thing. Philosophers are sometimes concerned about the issue of understanding and explanation of how a model works. If the model does not provide us understanding, it just provides us prediction, this may be seen as a negative thing. I'm not sure if that's the case. I think we use many tools for understanding their inner workings. Maybe someone here understands assembly languages, but most of us don't. And still we use our laptops totally fine. So maybe sometimes lack of understanding of inner workings of, let's say, machine learning model can be acceptable, and maybe it can be acceptable to us. It's a discussion that we should have. And sort of opacity, in particular in those complex models of long histories, can lead to an interesting situation. And the situation is this. Sometimes attribution of success or failure of a model to a particular component of a model may be very hard or impossible. So this sort of situation one imagines is we have different models. Maybe model A performs better under some conditions, and model B performs better in some other conditions or under some other constraints. So hopefully we could make a hybrid model that does what A does in one set of cases and what B does in other set of cases. But to do that, we need to attribute the success of the model to the component in order to construct the hybrid. And so it seems that in some cases of complex models with long histories, this is a very hard thing to do. Sometimes in climate cases, it can be done. There's a beautiful example of that in work of Q and Hall, where sort of widespread of a particular effect, snow albedo feedback, can to some extent be attributed to the way that vegetation on snow-covered surfaces is modeled. But it's a lot of hard work to sort of isolate a particular feature of a complex model that does that. Moreover, there can be situations where some forms of robustness, for instance, understood as convergence, may not be sufficient as reliable inferential tools when we're dealing with complex models. And there are examples of that in a logical situation. And so I'm not going to say anything more about this, but it seems that we may be dealing with sort of similar situation in such a star modeling, where it's my understanding is that it's hard to find a single sort of particular GMHD model that reproduces all of the features. And so, in a way, we may be running into this sort of situation already. Let me know. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Julio. Ready for a couple of questions? I know.
Slightly would take issues with your last statement about us not really understanding Sagittarius A star. I mean, what's very important if we deal with GRMHD simulations and so forth, I mean, they're really obscure. And I recognize what you said, this sort of information transfer from the previous generation to the next one. I had a supervisor who actually was really old style physicist. He would know almost all physical effects, right? He could calculate in very short sentences, scales, and explain that in a few words. So you would understand. But then you never knew whether you're right. So you had to do numerical simulations to check whether actually you had overlooked something and so forth. So the role of numerics was actually just to confirm your intuition. I think physics is to some degree, it's somewhat also an intuitive process. And the simulation is an experiment that confirms your intuition or your hypothesis. And when it comes to like Sagittarius, I think it's a good example. We had two models 20 years ago from Ramesh about the EDAF. We had the JET model that we developed, and it was very basic, very simple physical things. And essentially the basic elements you find back in today's GRMHD simulations. And having those in the mind, at least for me, helps me to understand the GRMHD simulations, which is sometimes a feeling, and no insult meant, some of those who start with GRMHD simulations don't understand anymore, because they start with numerics. But I think you first need to start with like pen and paper, understand what's the basic process is happening here. Why is circular polarization suddenly flipping, or some of the basic issues. And so I think that's where maybe we need to understand that jumping right into a simulation is the wrong thing. That understanding and I think intuition has to come first, and then you test it, rather than just using your experiment or your simulation as a real world, because it isn't.
Right. I don't think we disagree in any sense. I just want to clarify that I'm not suggesting that you do not, we do not understand Sag star or anything like that. I'm just saying that there are cases where attribution of the success of the model to a particular component is hard, and we may be running into some of them, or maybe not yet, and then it's great, but it's a risk that I think we can all recognize.
There are no other questions. Let's thank Juliusz again.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jamee Elder from the Black Hole Institute.
Okay, hello. I'm here as one of the co-leads of the Foundations group. And the Foundations group is a little different from the other focus groups in that it builds on the existing Foundations seminar at the BHI. This has been around for a while, and it brings together philosophers, historians, physicists, astrophysicists, mathematicians to discuss foundational issues. And so this is sort of what I'm going to be talking about today. To start off, what is foundations? What are foundations? So I think of this as being, foundations lies in the overlap between philosophy and physics and other subjects in terms of the content and the questions that we're asking. It's in this continuity between the different disciplines. Traditionally, Foundations has been focused on understanding theory. And so in the Foundation seminar, historically, we've discussed things like the global structure of spacetimes, the nature of singularities, the analytic extension of Kerr. And these have all been fruitful and fun discussions. But today, I want to think about what happens when the Foundation group takes on this new role as part of the ngEHT, and what that might look like. And I think that when we are doing foundations of black hole astrophysics, it requires a sort of more expansive notion of what foundations is. For a start, astrophysicists are dealing with black holes in this messy, non-idealized cosmic context. And so this presents its own challenge for thinking about the sort of connection between theory and real world black holes. And so in thinking about what the foundations of black hole astrophysics looks like, I think we also need to sort of promote observation to a role that's equally foundational to theory, and have this sort of dual perspective about what counts as foundational. But of course, there's somewhat of a tension in that you tend to think of foundations at the bottom and building up. And if you have foundations at either end, this leads to perhaps a tension, but I would like to think of it as a kind of complementary perspective. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we bridge the gap between theory and observation, how we think about the relationship between those two, especially in terms of models and simulations. And in doing so, also thinking about sort of bridging these two perspectives about what foundations is. So to motivate this a little bit, it's clear that there are challenges for applying theoretical results about black hole solutions to real world black holes. So just to take an example of this, if you think about the no-hair theorems, or of course this refers to several things, but for concreteness, something like the statement that they're stationary, axisymmetric, electrovacuum black holes are per-Newman. Theorems of this kind rely on a range of mathematical and physical assumptions in order to go through things like analyticity, the assumption that black holes eventually settle down to stationarity, the assumption that there's no matter in the universe, things along these lines. And these assumptions that go into these kinds of theorems range from perhaps the questionable through to the manifestly false in the case of, for example, the assumption of no matter. Of course, this is very strictly speaking. And so there's a range of reactions you can have to this in terms of thinking about the physical applicability of these theorems. On a very strict view, recently we had our first history, philosophy, and culture workshop where we discussed some of these issues. One view that sort of emerges as a very strict kind of mathematician's view, where if the assumptions behind a theorem are not true, then arguably that the theorem is not physically relevant. Now, this of course is a very strict reading of this. And I think that there's a lot appealing in this view. It reflects a kind of very, it reflects a carefulness about what the actual implications of theory are. But another view that emerged, and here I'm using Garla's terminology of calling this a practical view, is one where when we're thinking about the approximations and idealizations that go into a theorem, instead we're aiming for something a little bit less than truth and really just aiming for some kind of reasonably accurate mathematical description of the world. And so what I want you to take away from this is just, look, approximations, idealizations, these are the bread and butter of our representations of the world through theory. And the real question is, when should we be worried that these undermine the applicability of the theory? And how do we think about the domain of applicability of theorems that rely on idealized assumptions? And so for the rest of my time, I'm going to provide just a very brief philosophical perspective on the role that models and simulations play in bridging the gap between theory and observations, and bringing theory into context of the world. And I'm just going to be briefly touching on some philosophical issues very quickly. So think of this as sort of an invitation for engaging in further conversations about this. Okay, so in the last few decades, philosophers of science working on scientific modeling have taken what might be called a pragmatic turn that emphasizes paying attention to scientific practice. So what this means when thinking about modeling, one idea that comes through is that we should think of models as a kind of mediating instrument or tool. So here I've got a physical instrument or tool because I don't have as many pictures as all the rest of you have. Once you start thinking about models in this kind of way as kind of tool, then it results in a kind of shift in what you think makes a good model. So some philosophers, such as Nancy Fresher, who is here, have argued that this leads to a shift away from thinking about the truth or accuracy of a model in favor of emphasizing the reliability of a model, its use as a tool for guiding the scientific inferences or other products of science. Other philosophers emphasize something similar, the adequacy for purpose of a model, whether you're using a tool within its domain of applicability or a purpose for which it's well suited. So for instance, this axe, really good axe for creating kindling, not so good for chopping down a big tree. Similarly, we might think of models as good relative to a particular kind of application. And so overall modeling is not aimed at some kind of perfect mirroring of the world, but rather at providing a kind of reliable tool to guide scientific inferences. So on the positive side, here's what I think it means for looking at the relationship between theory and observation. Models play this role of kind of bridging the gap between theory and observation. And again, I've got a very basic diagram here to illustrate this. So we can think of models as having a sort of hierarchy or network in between theory and observation. And on the one hand, this means that models help determine the empirical content of a theory, the sort of predictions of a theory in a particular context where theory itself, at least strictly speaking, might have troubles getting at predictions. On the other hand, looking at this from sort of flipped perspective, models help make observations relevant for theory. They make the observations informative about theory and enable us to actually use data to test theories. And so models are playing this mediating role that actually brings theory and observation into context. One sort of problem that philosophers worry about a lot is what we call theory ladenness. What this is roughly is the idea that the theoretical presuppositions that go into observations or experiments sort of shape the results. And in extreme cases, it can be such that the possible outcomes of your observations are biased such that you're guaranteed to make observations that are that match with your theory. And so consistency with theory is all but guaranteed by the theoretical presuppositions behind the observation. And if models are mediating this relationship between theory and observation, one worry is that this can lead to a kind of vicious circularity when it comes to justification. So, and so if you're making observations to test your theory, but those observations are using models that are sort of based on theory, then you can get a kind of circularity problem. And I think an example of this, where this kind of worry crops up, is in some work I've done on the looking at the LIGO-Virgo-Kagra collaboration, and in particular the use of general relativistic models in order to make their observations and test PR. And I want to, at the risk of sounding like I'm being very provocative, I want to say that I ultimately don't think that this is a problem and that it can be resolved. But in the last sort of few minutes, I'm going to make a bit of a comparison between the kinds of roles that I see models and simulations playing and the kinds of theory ladenness that might crop up as a result between the LIGO-Virgo-Kagra case and the EHT or ngEHT case. So if we look at LIGO-Virgo-Kagra, they're doing a direct detection of gravitational waves using, in particular, match filtering, template-based search. This leads to a kind of obvious theory ladenness in the sense that you're using models to extract a signal from the data. And secondly, there's this role of direct observation of binary black hole mergers and other compact binaries using a Bayesian parameter estimation. And this relies on general relativistic models such as the DOVNR and IMR phenom families. And again, this second role leads to a kind of concerning theory ladenness in the sense that observations of black holes are very much reliant on general relativistic models. So when you go to use these observations in order to test GR, yes, you can show consistency, but going beyond that is quite challenging. Now, I do ultimately think that they are able to do this through the various tests of GR that they perform, for example, using JW15 and I14. Things like the residuals test, frequency test, and parameterized deviations tests are very much geared towards looking for ways that this theory latenness, the circularity problem might be biasing their results or leading them astray. And through those those tests, they're able to sort of provide constraints on ways that the theory latenness might be masking deviations from GR. Now, what about the EHT case? Well, it seems to me that in terms of the imaging itself, so this direct evidence for the black hole shadow, or indeed for these black holes, given that this relies on algorithms that don't seem to make strong assumptions about the nature of the source, this looks like it's not very strongly theory latent, in contrast to sort of the match filtering or the observations of black holes. On the other hand, once you start doing parameter estimation of the source, making physical inferences about the source on the basis of, say, GR and HD simulations, this does look to be a fairly theory-laden process. Now, I should say theory latenness is a fairly generic feature of science, so this is not automatically worrying. But it does require some care and thinking through, being very clear about the assumptions that are being made, and sort of being constantly on the lookout for ways that it might be masking deviations from expectations. And this, of course, is something that the EHT has been very clear about looking for throughout. Now, as we move into the ngEHT, we're looking at more sources, perhaps some, as was mentioned briefly the other day, perhaps even doing template fitting for some kind of sources. Then we start also being concerned about the issue of theory latenness. But looking towards the LIGO Virgo Kagra example, I think we can see that these kinds of concerns can be diffused. In the EHT case, you have independent lines of evidence into some of these systems, such as Sagittarius A star, that provides a kind of check on and loosens reliance on particular assumptions about the source. Similarly, something like a parameterized deviations test, as LIGO does, and it's been discussed here, also provides a kind of check on these kinds of problems. So some final remarks. I said that, strictly speaking, theoretical descriptions rarely, if ever, apply to real-world systems. I'm being a bit provocative in the wording there, because we're always making approximations and idealizations, and it's really up to models and simulations to bridge the gap. Thinking of models as instruments prompts us to focus on adequacy for purpose or reliability over truth or accuracy, thinking of them as reliable tools. I think I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that validating models in astrophysics is hard work, and the theory latents of observation can lead to potential circularities. Nonetheless, I've said that I think that these are worries that can be overcome. And the Foundation's focus group is going to have to grapple with these challenges as we continue discussing foundational issues, such as the properties of the Kerr metric. And finally, an invitation. The BHI Foundation Seminar meets on Mondays at 10. We have an online element to that. That's 10 Eastern time, so please join us. Always looking for more people. You can email me or co-lead Martin Resort.
Thank you, Jamie. We have time for one or two questions.
Hello, thank you very much for the nice talk. I have a question regarding exactly how the priors we put into our models to make observations. It seems to me that this is kind of inevitable at this era because of, first, extremely big data, and secondly, because we want to make always more and more advanced science, it seems to me that if we put some priors to what we observe, we usually are able to grasp even better or more fundamental things. Do you think we should be more cautious and turn our back to the prospects, or maybe find another strategy to achieve both these things of being not very biased, but also being able to making very advanced science?
So, I mean, I think it's always a balancing act between how much the priors and the other assumptions that you want to sort of embed in your observations. And ultimately it comes down to different kinds of values that you have. If you want to be very conservative, then you want to hold back from making those assumptions. But if you want to get the most out of your data, then you want to put in more. And I think you should be doing both of those things. And it's just important to be clear about what you're doing. And if you are being sort of bold and putting more informative priors or building more assumptions in, then just understanding that that could be leading you astray. And I also think that with things like with priors or with using different kinds of algorithms, and here I'm getting into some more work with Juliusz from Chess, who we really should from. These kinds of algorithms, priors, you can judge their reliability in the similar analogous way to how I was discussing about reliability of models. There's a kind of similar thing going on there. We can look for the robustness and see how those assumptions make a difference.
One more question there. Remo?
Yeah, hi. So when Maxwell, I've been told that when Maxwell actually derived his theory of electromagnetism, he used like weights and springs and so his model, well, that was his instrument, right? And it is completely not applicable in a sense to the electromagnetism on one level, but on the other level, it perfectly describes, of course, the underlying exchange of energies and all that. So I take a little bit of exception to your statement about truth and tools, is that I cannot think of any useful tool that in modeling does not actually capture some even abstract truth about what you are modeling. If you can give me a counterexample, that's good, but I just can't see that a connection is ever broken.
Okay, so when I'm talking about truth here, what I mean is that it's, literally true, full, rich description of the system, getting every aspect right. So I'm taking a very high standard of truth when I say, okay, so if you're thinking about the spring models, there's a sense in which there's something true, but you have to understand the kind of connection between the model and the target system in order to understand the nature of that truth. And I think this isn't, of course, models are representational in some sense, but they're imperfect representations. You're not looking for a perfect mirroring of the system.
Okay.
And so that's the kind of shift towards emphasizing them being a reliable guide to the target system. And the truth of the inferences is more important. But the truth of the model itself isn't really the right.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut off the discussion at this point to keep us in time for coffee. Thanks again, Jamie. Next up, we have Niels Martens, who's going to talk to us about scientific collaborations, what makes them work, perhaps what does not make them work as well.
Good morning, everyone. I am here to represent the collaborations focus group. And what we are all about is the relationship between the individual ngEHT member and the collaboration as a whole. Now, for various reasons, the history of science, philosophy of science, sociology of science, and adjacent communities often tend to be quite separate from the STEM communities that you are a part of. And to be fair, these communities have various aims. Many of them don't actually have to do with directly supporting the science or the scientists. In that case, it's fair, but of course, a big chunk is actually about trying to support the science and the scientists. And in that case, it's of course very suboptimal if there's not a lot of integration, engagement going on. So what we don't want to be doing is that we just do our own research for a year or two, then come to you and you'll be like, who are these people? And we will tell you, Here are 5 things to improve your collaboration. Good luck and goodbye. Right? That's not how we want to go about this. We think if this is going to work, it needs to be a continuous dialogue. We want to continue the dialogue that was started during our first workshop in Boston in February. That's several of you attended. And so we very appreciative that we are embedded in this collaboration as a working group right from the start. So the way we envisage this is that right, will be a continuous dialogue. We'll try to make explicit some decision points about how to structure one's collaboration. Right, some of these might be blindly copied from previous collaborations. Some of these you might have already discussed, either implicitly or explicitly. So what we want to do is to make these explicit. Here, your input, here, your thoughts on this, and then we can provide certain options from the literature, from our own research, mention some benefits, drawbacks, and then together we can try to implement these with trial and error and try to create the best collaboration possible. Because this is kind of a very unique, it doesn't happen very often that we have all these communities together. We have a very unique chance here to try to create the best possible collaboration and be a gold standard for collaborations out there. So really the main message, my main message here today is that you guys need data. We also need data, namely your input. So my main message here really is come talk to us so we can together talk about what's the best way of structuring a collaboration. And so that's really the main thing I have to say. But nevertheless, in the next 7 minutes or so, I want to do 2 more things. First of those is to make explicit an ideal for the ngEHT collaboration, which seems to be had by those of you we've already interacted with. So what I want to do is to make that explicit, to check if that's indeed the case. Now there's a much larger group of the chunk of the collaboration here to check if that's indeed what we're all aiming for and see if there are nuances and qualifications that we haven't thought of. So that's the first thing I want to do. And the second thing is to raise some questions related to how you might cover, related to the governing structure of the collaboration, also the way knowledge is formed and decisions are made. That's what I'm going to do. So let's start with an ideal for the ngEHT collaboration, which many of you, those we've already talked to, seem to have. And that is that the ngEHT collaboration should be somewhere in the middle of this spectrum of scientific groups in terms of how their governance is structured and knowledge is created. Right. So on the one hand, one extreme, you might have what we call the top-down scientific groups. On the other extreme, we have what we might call bottom-up scientific collaborations. Right, so examples on the one hand might be LHC or to some extent like a Virgo, and on the other bottom-up side of the spectrum, we have scientific communities as a whole, or for instance, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it seems to be the case, but I'd be happy to discuss it with you if that's indeed what we all agree on, that the ngEHT should be somewhere in the middle of these. So what do I mean when I say top-down, bottom-up? So typically, very top-down hierarchical structures when it comes to scientific groups of scientists tend to, scientists tend to be together in one physical headquarters, tends to be a very centralized funding stream, and often there's this one or maybe a few main purposes that entity that group is all about. And in these cases, often the collaboration is prioritized over the individual, right? It's all going for this one aim or a few aims, and the individuals are there mainly to support that one big aim, which can mean that consensus is often prioritized over dissent, diversity of opinions, and that it's often considered important that the group of scientists reaches agreement before publication, right? It's agreement that you form a unified front with respect to other communities and the public. And often these types of groups can be quite hierarchical in the sense that if you're kind of on the bottom of the hierarchy, there's not a lot of freedom, not a lot of decisions to be made, but there's a large number of committees, boards, etc., that make most of the decisions. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the bottom-up approach to how these communities are structured and how knowledge is formed and decisions are made, right? So their communication often happens not in one building where everyone is together, but right, people spread across the world. They need to communicate at conferences via publications or maybe review articles and reports. Funding is much often on a smaller scale based on small projects. And authors tend to coalesce in and out of collaborative projects. Sometimes authors write papers by themselves. And in this case, there's a lot of room for individual freedom. You can basically do whatever you want as long as you can get the funding for your relatively small project. And there it's totally fine if there are different views, right? If one group of authors publicizes one result, one view, another set of authors conflicting results. And then this is kind of brought together in a coherent narrative, if at all, only at a much later stage, right? For instance, in review articles, textbooks, or in the case of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, in reports that they create every 3 years, where they try to bring all of this together, right? Where there's a small group of authors which writes the report, and then every climate scientist is allowed to provide comments, and those are then incorporated in the second draft. And in this case, many of the decisions, many of the routes that are taken, directions, etc., was all decided kind of at a much smaller level by individuals or small groups of individuals. So this is kind of, no, this is a spectrum. Here are some of the potential advantages or disadvantages of each side of the spectrum, right? So the top-down side, if you have one specific aim and you need a lot of money, etc., then this approach can be very efficient to actually get that done, right? If you do this with a few people, you're not going to get billions of dollars. It's somewhat controversial whether this approach is good or bad for the legitimacy of science. So you might think if we want other communities in the public to trust us, then we need to have one, right, one opinion, form unified front as a collaboration, as a group, present that to the outside world in publications. We should not show too much disagreement. It's all about if you want others to trust our results, then we should deal with disagreement internally and only show a unified front to the outside. Some of the potential drawbacks of this top-down approach is that it can be difficult to allow individual creativity. It can be difficult to carve out individual PhD projects where it's not just that you're an author on many multi-authored papers, but actually have your own project. And it can be difficult to give credit where credit is due to individuals, especially for junior members, but of course also for senior members. And the bottom-up side of the spectrum is kind of the other way around. It's way more inefficient, right? Lots of individuals do whatever they want to do as long as they can get funding for their projects. Some might say, okay, what does this mean for the legitimacy of science, trust in results? Some might say, well, actually, science is a realistic portrayal of science is all about dealing with uncertainty, accepting that there's results change over time when more information comes in. If you want to others, the public or other communities to trust us, then it's all about showing how science really is and showing there is disagreement, mentioning drawbacks, advantages of certain approaches and publishing them, and not only dealing with them internally, but just being very honest to the outside, and then only at a later stage trying to draw this all together. And in these cases, there tends to be much more room for individual creativity, for individual PD projects, and also for individual credit. So this is the spectrum. And it seems that many of us that we have talked to want the ngEHT to be somewhere in the middle. So I think the main challenge for the collaborations focus group and a challenge for the collaboration as a whole is to make sure that we are going to be the best of both worlds, right? And not accidentally end up being the worst of both worlds. So this seems to be the ideal for some of us. And basically what I want to ask you is if the majority of us agree with this, or if there's some nuances, qualifications, if it's not actually what we should be aiming for. Okay, that was the first part. Let me now raise a few questions related first to how we might set up the governing structure for the ngEHT, and then secondly about how knowledge is formed, how decisions are made within a collaboration like ours. So during one of our first, so we have monthly plenary sessions with a whole working group, and during the first of those, we invited Noah Feldman, who is a professor of law at Harvard, to discuss several options for how we might go about structuring a collaboration like ours. And here are some questions that need to be considered, right? So one thing you might ask is, are there certain roles for which people who take up those roles should be elected? Maybe you think that should be the case for several roles, maybe just for a few roles, or maybe we think that should not be the case at all. Another important question is, of course, also who needs to be represented in the governing structure. So an obvious answer is, well, the scientists, the engineers, you guys. Another thing to take into consideration is that often in the collaborations, a lot of innovation, a lot of strength, a lot of work is being done by junior members. Those don't often tend to be represented as much, which means we might not be harnessing all the power they represent. Especially in collaboration that takes many, many years. Junior members at some point will become senior members, so we would do well to take that into account. Other stakeholders that might need to be represented is, right, we had to talk with Juliusz about the ngEHT partner institutions associated with the dishes. Might want to think in what sense do these need to be represented. And what is typically overlooked are the local communities, right, where the dishes are going to be. We might think these also need to be represented and as early as possible. Some other related questions are, where are the decisions made? Are they made at the top or by lots of people? So how diffused or generalized should the power structure be? And another question is, what does it mean to be a member of a collaboration like ours? Right? How do we define membership? What rights come with being a member? What duties? What does it take to become a member? Should it be approved by some committee or maybe by the PIs of the working groups? Or can anyone join who would want to join and wants to contribute? Okay, then let me end with the final slide, which is about how knowledge is formed in a collaboration like ours. And scientists don't always like to hear this, but the output in terms of papers and how they're perceived by the public, of course, depends on nature and how we designed our instruments to figure out what's going on in nature. But on top of that, to some extent, it also depends, right? The way the papers end up looking depends on how the collaboration is structured, the social structure, the governing structure. So one thing to consider is how communication flows within a collaboration. So for instance, this is analysis of the Atlas collaboration at the LHC, where the nodes are members of the Atlas, and the edges indicate that they have directly emailed each other. And then it turns out this naturally falls apart into 6 sub-communities. And the size of these nodes is a measure of how central these people are in the sense of how many shortest paths of communication go via them. And then it turns out each of these communities has between 1 and 5 of these very central people who kind of brokers or liaisons between or within communities. And then you might ask questions such as, okay, how hierarchical is this community, right? You might expect for something like LHC that it's quite hierarchical. So you might ask, for instance, do the big nodes mainly talk to each other and the smaller nodes mainly to each other, and there's not a lot of communication between the bigger and the smaller nodes? Turns out actually for the LHC, for the Atlas, it's mainly neutral. There's actually a small tendency for bigger nodes to be more likely to communicate to smaller nodes. So it's actually not as hierarchical in terms of communication as one might have thought. So then you can ask, okay, so it would be nice to do a similar analysis for the ngEHT. You might ask how hierarchical, non-hierarchical we want it to be. Do we want it to be even less hierarchical than the ngEHT? Which mechanisms might promote this or not? And also need to be careful of, I think more communication is always better. That's not obviously the case. There's a lot of work being done from a social epistemology where it actually turns out that if there's too much communication, especially at an early stage, then the collaboration is less likely to arrive at a true result because new ideas kind of get shot down too early. And this, of course, also connects to where in the ngEHT collaboration, where the 4 groups, when trying to create an image, initially didn't talk to each other. Yes, so these are some things to take into account. Some other issues related to how knowledge is formed is how do we deal with authorship? Are members automatically authors? Can one be an author on an ngEHT paper without being a member? Are there going to be mainly collaboration papers with the whole collaboration? Or can there be many, many smaller groups? Also, how many people are actually going to be involved with the writing? Because it turns out, of course, you want many people in a way involved, but as everyone is going to write, and it turns out, according to standard readability measures, the more authors actually write a paper, it becomes less readable. And also, the more people are involved, it tends to become, the claims tend to be become more conservative. So it's important to be aware that, right, how the paper ends up being, the claims being made depends on how many people are involved, and not just on the actual physics being done. And of course, credit is an important issue. How do you make sure that people get the credit they deserve? If you have 300 authors, there can only be one person can be the first author. So you might think of either having smaller papers or doing what we're doing with our own white paper, following the IPCC, where there's different categories of authors, like contributing author, coordinating author, lead author, and also for all the chapters, different authors. So then it's very easy on your CV to specify exactly what you do and don't deserve credit for. And this also relates to how one deals with disagreement in collaboration, right? Are we only going to aim for trying to read papers that present the result, the facts that the collaboration as a whole has determined, or are we going to allow different disagreements to be published by different subgroups of the collaboration, realizing that this is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of involved, and then we need to think about what does it mean, how does one phrase, what language does one use when phrasing a result, right? When has a fact been established, so to speak, right? So in the particle physics communities, very clear conventions have been developed, right? 5 sigma for discovery, etc. That's less clear in astrophysics community. So these are things to talk about, how to deal with disagreement, when do we have results, how do we phrase the results. And then maybe one thing to end on is that I don't think I'm the only one here who's somewhat confused about the relationship between the EHT and the ngEHT. Might be something to talk about. Let me just stop there and say that we would love it if you came to talk about us, about all these issues, right? We'll be here today and tomorrow. We're of course also on the Slack, and we have monthly meetings of the collaborations focus group, monthly meetings of the whole focus group. So I hope to continue this dialogue with you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Niels. We have time for one question. I'm thinking that everyone's ready to go to coffee. I saw Jeff's hand go up first.
Thanks for the interesting talk. I'm wondering if you have some examples in mind of successful projects that sit in the middle ground, and maybe examples of unsuccessful projects that sit in that middle ground.
Yeah, so when it comes to the successful ones, I'm not so sure I can think of one collaboration which ticks all the boxes. Yeah, so I don't think I can think of one which satisfies them all. So what I was trying to say earlier, I think there are examples on each side of the spectrum which do very well in some respects and not so well in other respects. So I think the IPCC, for instance, does very well when it comes to credit. The LHC has a lot of problems for PhD students to figure out, right, to really kind of write a PhD thesis that's their own and not just lots of contributions. So I'm actually not so sure I have a good example. I'd be happy to hear if other people think there are. So I think that's why we have a great opportunity here to create something that maybe hasn't done before, at least not in physics. Yeah.
I would encourage people to continue this conversation during the coffee break. And meanwhile, I think the LOC has a few comments to make. And let's thank all our speakers again.
Right, so sorry for keeping you 1 minute away from coffee, but this is important. So first things, please share your slides in the Google Drive, which is now pinned on the Slack channel, because otherwise I will chase you down and you will not like it. So please just that right there. I mean, the other option is to drop them as a private message on Slack on whichever LOC member is there. Now, second announcement is the Junior Scientist Fireside Chat, which is going to take place today at 6 p.m. Probably right outside the restaurant, Via Lactea, in those, I don't know how to call that, but there. And finally, and this is, you're going to like this, we will start tomorrow's session at 10, right? Yes.
Did you take this off?
So you got 1 more hour, either of sleep or party hard, your choice. So please, I won't keep you from your coffee now. So please, that's it. Thank you.